The story is about a man from upper New York, a very sophisticated, middle class, upper middle class artist, had a business and a family with 2 daughters, extremely happy and a very gifted violinist. And he was top of the society. He had very good friends, and he went to Washington to play, and he brought the house down. And 2 young men came, and they had a wonderful time and a wonderful dinner, and they had a glass of brandy, and he woke up in a whole other place, chained. And then he was kidnapped and sold into slavery, where he spent 12 years as a slave. And he witnessed, which is wonderful, he was able to write. He started with a piece of wood and some Beatles ink, and he finally wrote this 12 years later, the book. And finally wrote his notes and became rescued 12 years later. And he lived to tell that story. And Sue Eakin, Frank Eakin, my partner's mother, got all that stuff together to make the book. And then, for some wonderful divine providence, I was called to do the audiobook. And it took quite a while. I had to take a lot of breaks. Because From Roots was one thing, but this was another. So, having told that story, here I am to talk about the audiobook of 12 Years a Slave, the book itself, my book, An Actor and a Gentleman. And I'm almost finished with the audiobook of that. Found a new thing to do, and it's a wonderful thing to say that was then, this is now. Now God has seen fit for we need each other desperately to be together to save its planet, to make it a better world for our children. God works in very mysterious ways,
Yes,
you know. And here we go. We need each other now. We desperately need each other.
Well, you've mentioned it twice that there is a difference between Roots and 12 Years a Slave.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious to know what, in your mind, is the difference? Because this one you said you had to keep taking breaks.
Yeah. Well, I had to take a little breaks in Roots, but they watered it down so it would be palatable for everyone as television. This time, they hit the nail on the head. It's going to leave us very emotional, which it should in motion pictures. And I think the good reason is because most of those actors are English. You know, I grew up with Steve McQueen, the motorcycle driver and stuff. And I said to Steve, you don't look like him, and you're black, and you sound just like Alfred Hitchcock. What's wrong with this picture? And he told this wonderful story. She said, I beg your pardon. I said, what? You know, they were objective, those Englishmen, and did a brilliant job.
From 12 Years a Slave. You have books and papers and can go where you please and gather intelligence in 1,000 ways. But your slaves have no privileges. You would whip one of them if caught reading a book. They're held in bondage generation after generation, deprived of mental improvement. Who can expect them to possess much knowledge? There's a sin, a fearful sin, resting on this nation that will not go unpunished forever. There will be a reckoning yet. Yes, Epps, there's a day a-coming that will burn as an oven. These were the foretelling words of Samuel Bass, played by Brad Pitt in the movie, delivered to the brutal slave master Edwin Epps in Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave. Bass courageously helped Solomon secret a letter to his family in Saratoga, New York, which resulted in his rescue on Bayou Beth. The autobiography was published 7 years before the Civil War, and Solomon was a free man of color who was kidnapped, chained, and shipped to Louisiana, where he endured his hellish bondage near the present-day town of Bunkie. Bass's statement capsulizes the story of slavery, the sin of the nation, the atrocity of a people, the vestiges of which continue to impact the daily lives of blacks and whites in America, from Bunkie to Saratoga, from Rodney King in '91 on the West Coast, to Zimmerman in 2013 on the East Coast. The issues that simmer beneath the surface today, flowing from the 19th century, continue to divide us a century and a half after that reckoning of the 1860s. Solomon's book was published shortly after his return to freedom. It added fuel to the abolitionist fire that helped turn public opinion in the North and march the country toward war. Here are some of the reviews in 1853 of his book, 12 Years a Slave. The Buffalo Express. If we do not sadly err it will prove of vast service in the great cause of freedom. If there are those who can peruse it unmoved, we pity them. The Detroit Tribune. The extraordinary narrative of Solomon Northup is the most remarkable book that was ever issued from the American press. And Frederick Douglass, its truth is far greater than fiction. Think of it. For 30 years, a man, with all of a man's hopes, fears, aspirations, with a wife and children who call him by the endearing names of husband and father. And then, for 12 years, a thing, classed with mules, torn from his home and family, driven into unremitting toil in a cotton field under the burning southern sun by the lash of an inhuman master. It is horrible. It chills the blood to think that such are. Solomon's book was a bombshell in the national debate over slavery. It was immediately compared to the best-selling fictional phenomenon, Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, published a year earlier in 1852. Uncle Tom's Cabin had a profound impact on public opinion in the North, and Solomon's true account validated Stowe's novel for the masses. It is said that when President Lincoln first met Miss Stowe, he shook her hand, smiled, and said, "So, you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Well, we know the rest of the story, don't we? Samuel Bass's day that would burn like an oven came to pass, and Solomon's story had contributed, at least in some measure, to helping build the tide of sentiment in favor of abolition. Little is known about Solomon's fate after the war. The circumstances of his death had never been discovered. His grave never found. And what happened to 12 Years a Slave? Did it become an American classic, essential reading, read by generations to follow, like Tom Sawyer or the present-day equivalent of Anne Frank's diary? No. There was no mass republishing beyond the 1850s, hardly a mention of it after the war. Perhaps due to the horrific bloodshed fresh on the public's mind and slavery abolished, the populace in the North and South didn't care to revisit Solomon's painful story. For decades, the only evidence of its existence was some dusty copies sitting on the bookshelves of private homes, including one in particular. In 1922, the New Orleans Item published this note in relation to someone who had requested a copy of the narrative. Headline, "Book experts can't find 12 Years a Slave." Dear editor, please print in your information bureau where I can get the book 12 Years a Slave, signed LCE, Bunkie, Louisiana. The editor replied, "The New Orleans Public Library and local bookstores report no such book can be found. New York publishers make a similar report." This is 1922. And then, in 1931, comes a 12-year-old daughter of a small planter from Compromise Plantation in Cheneyville, an avid reader, curious child, the eldest of Sam and Myrtle Lyles. Father and daughter take a casual ride in his farm truck 9 miles south near Bunkie to talk business with the most powerful of all landowners in Avoyelles Parish. Dr. Hayes was his name. His family owned Oak Hall Plantation, which stands only 2 miles from the old Epps property. As the two men shook hands, Dr. Hayes addressed the girl, my mother, Dr. Sue Eakin. He said, "Young lady, you're going to be bored sitting here listening to two old men. How would you like come into the library, read a book?" Well, you see where this is going. Here's Mom's recollection of that moment. "Oh, glory be." Mr. Hayes reached on the bookshelves in the family library and handed me the rare copy of the original edition of 12 Years a Slave. I began reading the book as rapidly as I could, becoming more and more excited with every passing moment. I recognized place names in Cheneyville, a short distance from our home, LeCount, where I attended school, and Bayou Beth, all of which delighted me. The names of families well known in the area, the Tanners, the Fords, the McCoys, kept me making mental notes to inquire later from these people about the Northup story. I searched for years for a copy of the old book for my own, but one was nowhere to be found. Then, when I entered LSU in 1936, I searched at Otto Clater's bookstore. I suddenly spied 12 Years a Slave and asked the price with trepidation. "What do you want that for?" asked Mr. Clater, known as an authority on rare books. "There ain't nothing to that old book. Pure fiction. You can have it for 25 cents. And that began my life with Solomon Northup. Mom went on to write her master's thesis on the narrative and spent 2 decades researching the book, authenticating Solomon's account from Bayou Beth to New Orleans and beyond. In 1968, she co-edited the first modern edition with LSU Press and Dr. Joseph Logston. The book began its life then in the academic market, where it has largely remained, highly respected, but limited in distribution. But for Dr. Eakin, the journey with Solomon was far from over. It was just entering a new phase. After all, her passion was researching and writing Louisiana's history, especially black history, and Solomon's story in particular, which she would continue to do for the next 40 years. The commercial market was very small for black history in Louisiana in those days, so relatively few scholars were researching it. But she felt that it was an untold, vital history, one that must be understood. She felt that in order for whites and blacks to truly come together, to get beyond stereotypes, to address the root causes of the problems in the African American community that plagued places like Bunkie and 1,000 other towns in the north, south, and the north, that an understanding of how we got here is essential. She felt that we must connect the dots of history to understand the economic and educational disparities, lack of opportunity, fear, anger, hopelessness. These didn't start yesterday. They mostly started back then. And the severe handicaps in education and opportunity institutionalized by slavery didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. There was another 100 years of Jim Crow. As Samuel Bass would say to white folks looking at these issues today, what did you expect? Dr. Eakin felt that 12 Years a Slave was the most compelling vehicle for communicating the black experience during the slave era. It is enlightening and heart-wrenching. It's one thing to learn the facts about the institution in a textbook, but it's another thing to experience it through the eyes of a dignified, intelligent, humble man like Solomon Northup. Mom never experienced Solomon's words in the very personal format of an audiobook. 12 Years a Slave is magnified through performance. Louis Gossett places flesh on the beautifully written narrative and gives Solomon a voice. And who better to tell the story than Lou? An Emmy winner as Fiddler in Roots, the first African-American male to win an Oscar, a native New Yorker like Solomon, a humanitarian who is passionate about the story and the subject. Lou places you there in Solomon's world. It's just you and Solomon as he relates the details of his life under Edwin Epps, the intrigues of plantation society, the handful of men who wrote the rules and controlled the economy like Edwin Epps. You experience Solomon's life as told from the heart, not through facts and figures. During production of the audiobook, I kept recalling the line from the 1853 review of the Buffalo Express, "If there are those who can peruse it unmoved, we pity them." Sitting across the studio window from Lou in L.A. as he performed the scene of Eliza's children being stripped away from her, sold off by slave trader Theophilus Freeman in New Orleans, tears started to flow. I looked on the monitor to catch the reaction of director Casey Kelly, who was sitting in Houston by satellite. Tears again. I knew this was going to be a special audiobook. The movie experience brings it all together on screen. A brilliantly written screenplay by John Ridley, Oscar-winning performances by Chiwetel Ejiofor and Michael Fassbender, the genius direction of Steve McQueen. My first viewing of the movie was a private screening in L.A. with Lou and members of our team. I didn't think that I would be moved by a movie that was over 2 hours long and so difficult to watch. And I was so familiar with the story, how would I be surprised? But paraphrasing Brad Pitt, it's a movie where, after exiting the theater, you just have to walk around the block to think about it. There was not a dry eye in the theater, male or female. An African-American team member of ours, Jason Peterson, who's here today, said that he cried the last 20 minutes. For me, with the realization that I had just experienced a profound film that would likely become a classic and help realize Mom's lifelong dream of spreading Solomon's story to a wide audience, it was spontaneous combustion. Emotion, lots of hugs in the lobby. The book, the audiobook, the movie, all elicit empathy and understanding. When you're taking that walk around the block, you say, that's what happened. Now I see the seeds of what we are experiencing today. I get it, Dr. Eakin. I get it, Mom. With empathy comes an open heart to have a candid discussion about race and ways that we can bond together and work together and build opportunity, build an economy together, prosper together. Does this sound idealistic? If you live in Bunkie today, home of Epps, it might. A white friend of mine from Bunkie said to me, "Frank, that sounds utopian." Little has changed in Bunkie since I moved away 35 years ago. African Americans, who make up about half the population, 56% I'm told, say they feel unwelcome, feel that whites want to avoid them, keep their distance. You live on your side of the tracks, I live on mine. Blacks believe that whites don't want to hire them. Virtually all businesses are white-owned, and many young blacks who are undereducated and have no job opportunities idly hang out on street corners, and too many sell drugs. There's a high teen pregnancy rate, and when the dads don't pay child support, they go to jail and develop a record that further dims their prospects for opportunity. There's considerable tension with the all-white police force that they say profiles them and continuously catching innocent blacks in this wide-profile net, making them feel unwelcome in their own town. A powder keg is building, they say. White businessmen in Bunkie say that young blacks generally don't have a good work ethic, that this is why the farmhands are almost all Mexican American. They say they don't behave properly, they lack skills and knowledge because there are too few parents pushing them to get educations, that government has given them too much of an incentive to stay home and collect assistance, removing motivation. And actually, some key black leaders concur. Whites acknowledge that they do keep their social distance in Bunkie. So while there is no legal separation, cultural separation remains almost completely intact. And now comes this movie. It's about their town, Bunkie. I received a call from a white friend of mine, grew up with. He said that based on the movie trailer, the movie looked pretty violent. He said that he and others were concerned there might be a riot. He said, well, it's just a trailer. Maybe it's exaggerated. I said, no, to the contrary, the movie is probably 10 times more violent than the trailer. It didn't settle him, but it did launch an interesting discussion. It launched a discussion about the need for dialogue, and the fact that he was concerned about a riot due to a movie's release was surely evidence that it was time. We had an intense discussion. A few days later, he had thought about it, and he agreed. He said, it's time to talk. He embraced it. Next, I called a black friend that I've known since childhood. His name is Kenneth Gorell. After 17 years in the military, Kenneth escaped the fishbowl of Bunkie after high school, got an education, traveled the world, and for the first time, he said, had deep personal relationships, friendships with whites. He saw that things could be different. But then he tragically received a bullet and was permanently paralyzed. Today, he sits in Bunkie again, watching the streets from his wheelchair through a large pane glass window overlooking Marshall Boulevard, right across the street from where my family lived. Kenneth is smart and insightful, and he's sad. He's sad at what he sees outside that window. He dearly wants the town to have this discussion. He believes there's a lot of work to do on both sides, and it must be based on caring and love and not government mandate. He provided a military analogy that you can throw up as much artillery as you wish to win the battle, in this case legal or government solutions to gain equality. And this was necessary in the first phase of gaining civil rights, he said, but at some point to win the war requires winning hearts and minds. And that's where we are today. One point of hope is a passionate mayor and some civic leaders that I met from both races who want a different future, but they battle a wave of apathy and stereotypes and racism. So I spoke with Lou, and we decided to help these people initiate the discussion in Bunkie. Lou and I and my team will be there tomorrow, bringing together townspeople, descendants of slave owners in the narrative, history scholars to add perspective, even a young world-class African-American web designer, Jason Peterson, from our creative team for inspiration, someone who grew up in a broken home with little money, got into mischief, but turned it around, mowing lawns to buy his first computer. And he made it with few advantages in the new economy. We're going to capture the discussion in a documentary for other bunkies around the country to view. And we're not just going to discuss problems, we're going to offer solutions based on what has worked in other communities. Kenneth Gorell sent me this Facebook message when I told him about this meeting in Bunkie, which he wants to participate in. Frank, you have gotten my attention. You have opened my heart and mind up, and there is hope after all for the good people of Bunkie. What I see in the African American community in places like Bunkie is pent-up potential, a vast creative workforce that can tap into opportunities from desktops. Maybe it's my entrepreneurial background, but it has to be nurtured. It has to be developed, encouraged, with training, with the helps of whites and blacks. In the internet economy, you don't need so much capital. You mostly need education, ambition, and a good Wi-Fi connection. I'm told they have Wi-Fi in Bunkie, by the way. And there are other examples for inspiration. John Ridley, the amazing black screenwriter of 12 Years a Slave, whose office is his desktop. Steve McQueen, the director, a soccer player who had artistic gifts and will likely win an Oscar for Best Director. Perhaps it's not so idealistic after all. What is happening now in Bunkie and what happens in the future is important, because it could be 1,000 other towns in the South and the North. It's the home of Epps, so it's an interesting place to start a discussion. If Bunkie can fix it, maybe there's hope elsewhere. Let's use this moment to start that discussion. Life is so much better when we work together as one big family. Wouldn't it be wonderful to help bring together the family of Bunkie? In her mid-80s, when my mother was in relatively good health, she wanted to publish a final edition of 12 Years a Slave based on her additional 40 years of research. She wanted one last shot at connecting those dots. While she always remained open to learning new facts that might change her conclusions, and she acknowledged that there were things that could never be proven or disproven about the narrative. Here's what she said. The basic facts of Solomon's journey to Louisiana and his movement through the Bayou Boeuf plantation country during his 12 years as a slave have been validated and provide the framework on which the story is based. She had proven Mr. Clater's pure fiction comment of 70 years earlier to be wrong. Her final book, which we republished recently, is currently ranked, as of this morning, 8:00 a.m., Amazon's #1 historical biography ebook. In the acknowledgments, here are Mom's last words on the narrative. Finally, it is complete. Solomon's story, one of the most important in American history, has been authenticated and placed in the context of the times. I have given my fullest effort. Now Solomon and I can rest. Thank you.